Some of you might remember that in years past I would take this time to do a bit of quizzing about the birth of Jesus, but it didn't turn out to be fun anymore when you all knew all of the answers about all the things that don't exist within the story. As we all know that Christmas season doesn't actually end until the 6th. We are celebrating what we know as Epiphany, when the visitation of the Magi today, but that actually doesn't happen until Tuesday. So you can remember that on Tuesday that we're jumping the gun. It's the 12th night, many of you know this, but the truth is I started thinking that in years past I've talked about the continued quote-unquote war on Christmas. And I'm convinced now that we probably should just stop talking about it, because I think on some level that it represents a deep discomfort with what's actually in the Christmas story. If we can argue about who has the last word, so one group of followers of Jesus want to complain that you can't wish someone a Merry Christmas because, well, there's a war on Christmas, and then another group of followers of Jesus like to go, what fools they are. That might include us, or at least me. And the truth is, I think the reality is that we've really missed the scariest parts of this whole story. Even as we depict the story in the manger, we leave King Herod out. And yet this story isn't complete until we get to King Herod. In fact, the lectionary passage for today ends with the Magi going home by another road. And nowhere then in the lectionary do we have this story of Herod massacring children in order to maintain power. There is blood in Bethlehem. The truth is, the birth of Jesus, the birth stories about Jesus, are so rich with meaning, but we don't really know the depths of the meaning so much. On some level, I'm afraid that we don't even really believe that these stories have the power to transform our lives. I'm convinced, though, that the birth stories really are this. That they're a wake-up call. They're a wake-up call for the religious and politically comfortable folks. And here's why I think so. You see, at Jesus' birth, it's poor people who were there. Shepherds, who, by all accounts, were dirty and untrustworthy, and they were ritually impure and not welcome in religious circles. It's not the religious community where Jesus shows up. It's not the political circles of power. Jesus' family finds refuge, as we now know, in a cave, and he's born in a food box for animals. Even the circumstances of his birth are a bit suspect. A teenage virgin bride. I'm right, who's going to believe that? The God of all the universe chose to be born in a situation like this? What fool would believe any of it? Well, it wasn't told in a vacuum. You see, in some ways, the birth stories are a direct challenge to someone else. You see, Caesar was born of a virgin. When Caesar was born, the stars marked his birth. Caesar was called Son of God, the eternal Prince of Peace. Does that sound familiar to anyone? The titles that we use for Jesus haven't always belonged to Jesus. But we've forgotten about that piece of the puzzle. And when we pick it back up, we have to say, oh, that means it has some political ramifications. So can we just argue about Christmas instead? The part of the story today is most pointedly directed at the religiously comfortable. Those who are certain about things in all ages. And this is not about being conservative or liberal. The truth of the matter is we're all conservative, we're all liberal in our own ways. Someone said, well, how do you explain the conservative and liberal divide within Christianity? And, well, this is an oversimplification, but I found it to be fairly true. Those who are more conservative theologically are often much more liberal and open in the the ways that they welcome people and the way that they're willing to do their faith. The doors are wide open, but the theology is narrow. And those who are more progressive and liberal are wide open in our theology. But our entry points are very narrow. You will do it our way. We're conservative in customs. So, as someone once said, liberals have open theology but closed doors. Not theologically, but in the ways that we expect things to happen. So this story is for all of us. We're all implicated, myself included. And in order to understand this, we have to understand who was King Herod to begin with. He was a great king. As far as kings go, he was amazing. He did more building in that area than in any other king that had ever existed. In fact, multiple cities that exist to this day are because of his building campaigns. And when he was young and coming into his own power, he faced down another rival with power and manipulation in ways that ought to make us pretty amazed. He knew how to deal with his political rivals. He could cut them down and use the power of Rome to do it for him. The truth was, his early years were marked with great uncertainty because rivals seemed to pop up everywhere. But he was astute at overcoming them and had one of the most remarkably long reigns of power. In other words, Herod was not someone to be crossed. He would cut you down. In fact, he even cut down one of his wives so that he could marry someone else. So who were these Magi who show up on the scene? We have to know who they are too. Well, they were magic workers, and I'm not making this up. This is literally what they were known to do. They were dabble in magic. They were readers of dreams. They were called sorcerers, which, by the way, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, was a stonable offense. And lo and behold, they're the ones who see the star. They're the ones who are so far outside, we don't even know where they're from. We just know from the east. You know, they're from over there. We don't care. They're just from outstate. Did y'all catch that? Mm-hmm. Okay, just checking. Right? These were outsiders of the pure. They were seen as outsiders. I think I've made that point. And they show up. And they assume showing up, because in the East, they actually counsel kings. They say, we saw the star. And the kings go, oh, that's not good for me. Shows up on the scene, they go to King Herod. They assume that in the places of religious and political leadership that they would have found someone who would have at least seen the star at its rising. And guess what? Not one of them. No one saw anything or even knew that it happened. And this great good news is met with fear and terror. The response to the good news in those places, in the places outside of the power, was joy. The shepherds, the Magi, those who come are excited. But inside, those who should know better were filled with fear. They were too comfortable with the status quo. And when we are too comfortable with the status quo, any change is a threat that has to be eliminated, even at the cost of death. And so when Herod calls these religious community in to say, explain what's going on here, I've heard this news, they do his bidding. They come running to go deal with the political figures of the day. Apparently, it looks like they might be so concerned with the benefits they receive from Herod that they're willing to come and tell him what's going on, knowing full well that Herod will kill any rival. Think about that for a minute. The religious leadership knew full well who Herod was. Everyone knew that Herod would kill any rival. And he says to them, tell me where the Messiah is to be born. They know what's coming. And they decide without hesitation to give him all the information that he needs. They were in the back pocket. That's the problem when religious folk get too comfortable with any political party. When Herod seen, though, that he was tricked, and this is the beautiful part, he wasn't really tricked. The Magi just listened to the dreams as they always had. And they went home by another way. But when Herod was tricked, he was infuriated Because when you've been in positions of power as long as he has, that doesn't happen all that often. But see, he's not just struggling with Magi, he's dealing with God, who's fed him. And he, Herod now, sends and kills all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he learned from the Magi. Now, this story often gets quickly kicked aside by a number of scholars saying, well, we have looked at the historical records, and there is no historical record that there was ever a genocide in and around Jerusalem, around Bethlehem, at the time of King Herod. It's not there, so it could not have happened. So I have two thoughts on that. First one is, there probably was about 150, if that many, boys who would have been around, probably less, could have been more like 20. 2-year-old or younger boys. So think for a minute. Can you imagine just for a moment a great world power wiping out people and covering it up so that no one ever knows?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Is that so far outside the realm of possibilities? So when the scholars do this, I wonder whose bidding they're doing. But it's not just about that. This story is, if you're listening carefully and deeply, about another story in the Bible. Anyone have a guess? Moses. The killing of the babies. So it's supposed to bring up all of our multiple understandings to know that these things are happening. A baby is born who will save the people in poor conditions under suspect places. Because God has seen and heard the suffering of the people, and lo and behold, where do they escape to is Egypt. If you haven't gotten it by now, the story writer is telling us you have to hear this is also about Moses and so much more. This story is not brand new, but it is part of God's long salvation history saying no to the ways of empire. We know how it ended for Egypt. God heard, God acted, God sent a Savior. And this is the strange story of Christmas. And yet we never hear this story being argued about in the public arena. So maybe we just stop arguing over those pieces and say, oh, wait, I don't think you understand it all. It's not about saying or not saying Merry Christmas. Our faith has something different to say. We're entering a new year with new challenges, and it is time for us to figure out how we will hear these strange new stories. It is not the insiders. The more comfortable we are, the more we have to get out, put ourselves in places where, well, frankly, we're not as comfortable. If the birth of Jesus is all about the outsiders on the outskirts, outside the centers of power politically and religiously, are we listening? And what will that look like? Amen.